Okay, comrades, welcome back. The first speaker this afternoon will be Yassamine Mather, followed by Torab Saleth. I'll hand over to Yasmin.
Okay, I think this morning we discussed very much the international scene, the US's policies in the region and so on. I'm going to try and talk about why this deal was possible. In order to understand why this deal was possible, I need to talk about sanctions, I need to talk about the Rouhani presidency. I'll try and be very brief, and that will take us to the whole debate about the role of the Iranian working class, which will be Torab's session. One of the reasons why it's important to understand how this deal came about is because it gives us a very good understanding of what risks are facing it and how it will collapse. So it's an introduction for us to be realistic about the deal and the threat. The international issues, for those who weren't here this morning, I think we have to emphasize there is a change in US policy in the region. There is an element of change. It's not dramatic, but there is a change of direction. There is levels of that. But the crucial factor as far as Iran is concerned is the fact that sanctions really were affecting ordinary people. Why am I saying they're affecting ordinary people and they were raising opposition to the regime? Because we now know, through, in fact, the revelations through these discussions, we now know that the Iranian nuclear program wasn't dramatically affected by the sanctions. They made 35,000 centrifuges, according to the foreign minister. We know that the private wealth of senior clerics, including Ayatollah Khamenei, was not affected by this because his $95 billion foundation went away with very little problem. But if you speak to ordinary people in Iran, you do realize that sanctions did affect their day-to-day life, not just in terms of their jobs, their income. You can't live in a country that has minus 9% growth compared to 2008 and a 40% rate of inflation as the Iranians lived in most of 2010, 2011, and currently are still not seeing any benefits from the wonders of this deal, and not be affected by the economy. You can't live in a country where 30%, over 30% of the population is unemployed and not be affected by what is going on politically. And in a way, there was despair amongst people. There was the psychological effects of sanctions isolating the Iranians, but also what was addressed this morning, the brain drain, the constant understanding or the constant propaganda from outside that if only it wasn't for the nuclear deal, you might be better off, sanctions wouldn't be there. So that wasn't really true, because the Iranian economy might have faced quite a lot of disasters irrespective of sanctions. However, as a tool of propaganda, that was an added bonus to hammer it to people that that was the case. And at the end of the day, I think it was the complete absence of any rationale to justify this terrible economic condition, terrible situation under conditions of political dictatorship. I've said this before and I say it again. Political dictatorship creates opposition, there is no doubt. But if you have political dictatorship and together with it serious economic hardship, then people oppose it, people rebel, people protest. And we could see this situation in late 2012, I think early 2013. So contrary to the supporters of the reformist government in Iran, I have no illusions that it's a miracle by a moderate president. I really don't believe this. You know, everywhere if you listen to the Iranian media or foreign media broadcasting to Iran, it's the miracle of this moderate president. No, the candidates who stood in what Mike rightly pointed out wasn't a proper election in 2013. 7 out of 8 were in favor of making a deal with on the question of nuclear issues. 7 out of 8. There was one guy, Jalili, he's now become a figure of joke, but even the hardline supporters of Ayatollah Khamenei were in favor of making a deal. So to say that this was, if you like, the Iranian government accepting or succumbing to pressure is not an exaggeration. They accepted it because they had no other alternative. To also say that in some ways this was, we've maintained our right, as some of the supporters of the regime in general say, we've maintained our right to nuclear enrichment. Is what right? What does it mean for a country that says it can't afford to pay its workers daily wages? What does it mean to be able to have a nuclear power? It's power games by states. It's a competition between Iran and its neighbors. It's telling Israel, we've got a weapon, but for ordinary people, it's completely irrelevant. And in any case, as we'll discuss the deal very briefly, it's not very clear what they've maintained in that respect. But the government played the nationalist game. Both Ahmadinejad played it, and the entire regime, in my opinion, played the nationalist game. This is our nuclear industry. Why is it our nuclear industry? Most of it, from what I can understand, is black market, second-hand Russian or Belarus equipment put together at expensive cost, bought on the black market. The sanctions worked for a number of very important reasons. One of them was banking. The Ahmadinejad ministers, and in fact the reformists, were saying the central bank will never go under sanctions. The Americans showed they could do it, and they did it. The sanctions also affected Iran's sale of oil. Iran is now one of the sixth producer of oil in the world. It was the second, so it kind of collapsed. It's not just that we can't extract oil in Iran. It is mainly that you can't fill oil tankers in Iran because no one allows Iran to insure. No one insures oil that is from Iran. Governments who bought oil from Iran were told that they would face sanctions themselves, so they stopped buying Iranian oil, and that became quite a practice. But also, governments who were buying Iranian oil, like India, were told, don't worry, you don't have to pay for this. You can get it for free. So India, for example, owes Iran a lot of money, and it hasn't paid it because it knows it will be protected. As a result of all this, we could say that sanctions brought about or precipitated a move within the Iranian government. You can't call it regime change as complete regime change, but it has precipitated another faction, which in many ways is not very different, from its predecessor to power, and that is the Rouhani government. I referred to the presidential elections. I think the US wanted a deal with Iran and started the discussions long before this president came to power. It's quite clear that in 2013, in the autumn of 2013, discussions took place with the mediation of Oman between the then president Ahmadinejad and the United States. So again, it's not a miracle by Rouhani. What the deal has meant in terms of what has happened immediately in the last few days is the acceptance of Geneva Part 1. Geneva Part 1 is very clear. It's giving, Iran has stopped enriching uranium in Natanz. It's supposed to destroy its stockpile of 20%. It's doubtful whether it has started to do so or not, but it will be monitored. So it will have to. So we spent all this money, for all those who say this is a great victory for Iran, we spent all this money to build this nuclear industry, and now we are destroying the stockpiles, right? This is mainly for nationalists. There will be daily inspection of these plants, and as a result of all this, a number of sanctions, and very few of them will be lifted. If the first 6 months goes well, a number of other sanctions will be lifted. The current sanctions that are lifted include the car industry will get spare parts. The dual-use equipment will remain in the list of, obviously, because quite a lot of what the US identifies as nuclear development equipment can be used in the hospitals as well. So there's no dramatic change in those equipment. This is surgical equipment, babies' incubators, all sorts of other things. The medication might improve, but the main problem with medication is that it's Iran's currency. Iran's currency devalued after the SWIFT and the banking, the finance sanctions, to a third of its value, and it continues to do so. There has been little blips where it's gone up, but none of it is that high. And then we, of course, will see the spare parts for planes. I mean, that's, one would almost classify it as humanitarian aid, because Iranian planes have serious issues. They are using badly reconfigured equipment, endangering ordinary people's lives. So that will be lifted apparently this week. And there will be a lifting of petrochemical industry materials. So that should start. There is hope that the car industry will pick up. I have very serious doubts. I mean, if you know the Iran's car industry, you know that these belts, these production plants have stopped for most of the last 2 years. So the fact that I doubt if Citroën or Peugeot will immediately go back and restart that. And as a result, so far, for all the talk of the feel-good factor of the nuclear deal, we haven't seen any improvement in employment. There is more money for capitalists. But what we said, I think we mentioned it in the earlier session as well, it's wrong to think that Iran's Islamic government has been anything but a supporter of neoliberal restructuring. Ahmadinejad covered this with slogans about looking for the poor, looking after the poor, wearing old jackets when he started presidency. By the time he ended his presidency, he was in designer suits, from what I can gather. But you know, the change with the new government is that they are openly pro-free markets, they are openly pro-neoliberalization, liberal economics. One of the statements by Iran's Minister of Intelligence, Rouhani's Minister of Intelligence, only a couple of weeks ago was very telling. He said, we have to reduce all these socialist residuals of socialist thoughts in the minds of sections of the population. This is, you know, I'm not sure what residuals. I assume he means workers going on strike or workers demanding a decent wage. There is a serious attack on the left. The left is weak, the left is almost non-existent, but the government is saying this is a government that will clean Iran of leftist ideas, of clear Iran of leftist ideas. So there is a difference in the slogans, there is a difference in the terminology. Did Ahmadinejad support Iranian workers? Absolutely not. I think if you look at the laws that were passed, the privatizations that took place during Ahmadinejad, you will know he didn't. But he wasn't, if you like, he also wanted these specific sectors in his own circles to become more powerful, more rich as a result of the economic sanctions, and they benefited. The scandals that shook Turkey in December, Mike alluded to it, but the scandals that shook Turkey was all to do with sanction busting with major Iranian capitalists. One particular person, Zanjani, made billions of dollars, from what I can understand. He now owns an airline in Tajikistan, and he's the beneficiary of black market money laundering between Iran and Turkey. And Turkish ministers were involved in this. So we're talking of really large-scale corruption practices. But we are in a new era, and in this new era, our president goes to Davos. He doesn't go to Mecca, he goes to Davos. And in Davos, he tells people, we want foreign investment. Foreign investment is going to apparently save Iran from all the problems we face. Now, again, others have said European delegations have followed each other to Tehran. The Iranian government is saying we have cheap labor, we have skilled labor, we have unskilled labor, and we can sell it at the least price unit. So you can imagine that the Europeans at least are very keen to go back. Having said that, we have to realize that the Americans don't see this as a long-term deal. For the Americans, this is a temporary deal to resolve this particular issue at this moment. The immediate response by John Kerry, as Zangene was meeting BP and Shell and Total to get petrochemical industry working in while he was meeting them in Davos, Kerry went on television to say, we are not encouraging investment in Iran. We are not encouraging people actually using capital in Iran. And you can see, first of all, because this deal is very shaky, and I will go to the risks that it faces, but also because there is no point in a constructive, if you like, neoliberal economic policy. The Iranian government will follow the diktat, even at its current state of resolution or negotiations with the US, and there will be no need to make any major changes on those. We will not, and no one should expect to see any changes in terms of employment, better conditions for the labor force, both because these sanctions are still there and it will take a long time for any change in the situation, but also because the government is playing a very clear line. Negotiations with the West might show a sign of weakness. In order to counterpose this, the government is taking a very hard line against opposition, against political prisoners, on the issue of democracy. I cannot see, I don't know why anyone should be under any illusions that a government that kills 40 people in 2 weeks, and okay, they were not, in this last list there weren't political prisoners, but in the previous list there were. A government that hasn't released a single labor activist since it's come to power. A government that still holds Jarrahi in prison under serious medical conditions, a labor activist, is going to show any better or a less repressive policy towards its population. On the contrary, neoliberal free market ideas don't necessarily go hand in hand, unlike what its propagandists say, with democracy. They are best imposed on the conditions of authoritarian rule, and authoritarian rule in Iran is still there. But a government that has made a deal with the West, a government that looks as if it is weak in terms of the negotiations with US, is precisely doing the opposite internally. It's trying to say to people, look, just because we're soft on international scene, we're not soft on Iran politics. We're going to be as repressive, as dictatorial as we were before. And in this, I think the tasks for Hopi remain, and the tasks for Hopi are even more, because we have very clear agenda now. We have a very clear scene, and the Iranian workers are sending daily reports of their atrocious situation in Evin prison. So the least we can do, I suppose, and we'll leave that for the last session, but the least we could do is show solidarity with them. But this deal is by no means a done deal, and no one should consider that that's it, that the situation has come to a solution, or we are seeing a change, in a long-term change. It has many enemies, and inside Iran those enemies are quite numerous, mainly either people who are deluded, who believe, I don't know if they think the nuclear bomb will precipitate the arrival of the 12th Shia Imam, or whether they are under the impression that, they're so nationalist that they think that. But most importantly, there are economic cliques who benefited from sanctions. The economic cliques that had Zanjani as one of its people. These people do want sanctions to continue, because they've now just managed their sources, their outlets. They don't want this this deal to go through. The Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, I think is playing a very clever game. I don't think, although there is this week reports that he will benefit from the sanctions being lifted, his foundation will benefit from sanctions being lifted, there are no signs that he was terribly damaged by sanctions from what I can gather. But he's playing a very clever game, because if, at times we hear either through third parties, like people who have met him in secret meetings, that he's not very happy with the negotiations. He has his doubts. My guess is he will wait and see. If things work well, he will be definitely supporting his wonderful government, as he has said before. If things go pear-shaped, if there is more sanctions put by the US Senate, he can say, he can gather his groups to jeopardize the negotiations, and his comments will be very clear. I told you so. I did say I had reservations. Why did you meet Kerry? Why did you speak to these people? So he's in a very safe position in some ways. He has both sides. In the United States, again, we discussed at length the strategy, the politics of the current situation by the United States. And we identified the two main enemies, the Israeli lobby and the Saudis. The Saudis are as concerned. Moshe spoke a lot about Israel, so I'm going to concentrate on the Saudi lobby. For the Saudis, this is demotion. They are the staunch ally of the US. They are the, if you like, the country that holds the strings together, and suddenly they are demoted to second place. And for that reason, we do see in Washington the alliance of AIPAC and Saudi, Prince Bandar, who also went to France, against any negotiations with Iran. These people aren't worried by these negotiations. They just don't want any negotiations with Iran, because they see this slight tilt, this slight change in US relations in the Middle East. And because of all that, as John Kerry keeps saying it, as Obama keeps telling these people, there is no doubt that all options remain on the table and they can be withdrawn, and there can be a situation of war. So no one should take this lightly. In addition, because we live in a very turbulent region where a bomb in Syria, an attack in Lebanon, something else could make the Iranian more conservative factions of the Iranian regime, the pro-sanctions lobby, so to speak, do something erratic, and we will be back to square one. In terms of sanctions, we did oppose sanctions, so we should still oppose sanctions. But in order to understand Rouhani's government, I think we have to look at why it is still scared of a working class whose struggle started in the late 1970s, as a working class that did destroy and bring down the Shah's regime, and the working class that remains to today, for all the problems and all the weaknesses of the Iranian left, all the mistakes of the Iranian left, a working class that this regime, having done its negotiations with the US and having gone to Davos, fears so much. And I think that's will be with Torab.
Thank you, Yasmin. Okay, Torab, if you'd like to come up. Torab is going to be speaking on workers' organisations before and after 1979, which is the 35th anniversary, right now, and he's going to lead off nicely from where Yasmin finished, by the looks of it. So, Torab, over to you.
Yeah. Well, on the eve of the 1979 revolution, the Iranian working class was a relatively young working class, both in terms of its age and in terms of its history. By 1977, we probably had about 4 million workers in Iran, out of which more than half was actually created after the White Revolution in the early 60s. The industrialization that took place after the Shah's White Revolution increased the population of the working class tremendously. Most of these were migrants from rural areas, which were released from the land after the land reform. So it was a relatively young working class without a lot of experience. without much tradition of a struggle, because the first 10 years after the White Revolution, jobs were on the rise, the economy was in a sort of boom state, 8-9% rates of growth every year. So there was hardly any strikes for the first, say, 10 years after the White Revolution. But when the economic crisis of 1975 began to develop, which is when the White Revolution reached its limits, the industrialization model that pursued the White Revolution reached its limits. So gradually unemployment began to increase, and we faced a situation in which the phenomenon of shanty towns began to become a major phenomenon. Migrants from the rural areas not being able to find jobs. In Tehran, say in 77, we had almost 500,000 to 700,000 people living in shanty towns. So during the economic crisis, you begin to see signs of workers' struggle. But at first, they were behind the student movement or even the urban poor, the movement of the urban poor. But gradually, as they gained confidence, there were waves after waves of strikes. And with each wave, the number involved in the strikes grew until the last 4 months before the insurrection in February 79, we had a general strike involving over 3 million workers. Which lasted for 3-4 months. During this general strike, a lot of strike committees began to develop, almost within every industry. Also, because of the general strike, neighborhood committees began to develop, and there was quite a good linkage between the neighborhood committees and the strike committees. There was hardly any leadership, any political leadership as such. The left was in no position to lead this movement. And although on the face of it, it looked as if it's being led by the Islamic opposition, that wasn't really the case either. Because of the political repression during the Shah's period, a lot of these striking workers would find mosques as the best area to coordinate, for logistics, to get advice, to find the latest news. Mosques were the main meeting place even for striking workers. So a lot of these militant, active, leadership of the strike movement became very closely associated with the mosques, basically. But even a year after the revolution, you could still not say the working class is dominated by Islamic ideology or by, the Islamic leadership. But during this general strike, you could also see a whole confusion in the sense of the slogans and the demands that the working class was raising. There was no focus. There was no sort of central popular demand. Each, depending on the nature of the strike committee, the individuals forming that strike committee, or the nature of the industry, whether how old it was, how traditional it was, and how new it was, different combinations of demands were raised. But there were some, radical demands raised by the working class during this general strike, including even a sliding scale of wages and a sliding scale of hours, or the demand for freedom of political prisoners. There were political demands, and there were sort of what has been called sort of transitional demands raised by sections of the working class during this general strike. But when you look at it, there was hardly any focus. There was hardly any, and it didn't indicate any great level of political leadership within the working class movement. And in fact, the insurrection that took place in terms of actual people involved in the insurrection in Tehran, it was mostly composed of members of these strike committees and neighborhood committees. And after the insurrection, a lot of these strike committees had actually become armed, because in the course of the insurrection, quite a lot of arms were distributed among the population, and a lot of these workers' strike committees actually now had their own militias. And what happened immediately after the insurrection, because most of the owners and management of these industries had escaped or had left Iran, basically workers took over the industry. Both in terms of, if you remember, we used to always say workers' control is different from workers' management. Workers' management can come at a much later stage in the course of transition towards socialism. But in Iran, those sort of distinctions were blown away, and basically in most of the factories you had a form of workers. Workers would elect somebody from among themselves as the manager, because the managers had all escaped, and exercise workers' control. And there was a very interesting tendency developing in the first few months after the Iranian Revolution, which was workers' control on distribution. This put them in direct confrontation with the Bazari merchants. For example, factories would set up tents in the middle of Tehran and sell the products directly to the public. Also, all those strike committees, so this was a tendency which was very interesting in the first few months of the Iranian revolution after the overthrow of the Shah. Actually exercising workers' control not only at the factory level, but in distribution of goods from the factories. Which, as I said, put them in direct confrontation with the huge backers of the regime, the Bazari merchants. Also, all these strike committees were sort of transformed now to what was called Islamic councils, Islamic shuras. Almost every factory set up this Islamic council, and the old strike committee now called itself Islamic Shura, Islamic Council. Unfortunately, there was not a huge tendency for these shuras to unite in a sort of geographical sense of the term. They remained tied to the factory rather than to, in terms of becoming a political force. The council movement has to control regions, areas, rather than just limit itself to factories. You cannot get anywhere near situations of dual power if you don't exercise political power over a region, over an area, over a city, over a section of a city. At a factory level, I won't call that a sort of Soviet type of movement. Soviets for me would be geographically based rather than factory based. Otherwise you cannot exercise political power. This tendency, however, was picked up by the Islamic currents. The Islamic currents realized the potential in this. The students following the Imam's line, this was their title. This is the group of students who were based in Tehran's Polytechnic, who were actually behind the takeover of US Embassy later on and the hostage crisis. These students came up with a plan to unite these councils at sort of, say, Tehran level or city level. Unfortunately, the left did not take this up. The left abandoned this. The major forces of the left, which were, say, the Fedais, the Paykaris, concentrated mostly in smaller industries because they just did not know how to cope with larger industries in which there were many different currents. Because most of the larger factories, we had Islamic currents, we had this current, we had that current. The Fedais and the Paykaris prefer to go and concentrate on factories with 40, 50 workers, where if you recruited one, you could more or less dominate the factory. You could have a lot more control over a small factory if you had some implant in that factory than on a big major, automobile or bigger, industry. So they basically developed a council movement of their own, which, as history has proven, became totally irrelevant. So basically the workers' vanguard, these strike committees which had developed during the general strike, were left to the Islamic currents to organize and dominate. Secondly, they did not take up this challenge of the working class for control of distribution. Nobody took this challenge up, or to help it, to develop it, to make it more widespread in major cities. Thirdly, the working class itself did not really politically challenge the change of regime. The only strike committee which protested against the formation of the secret revolutionary committee, a revolutionary committee was set up by Khomeini, which basically controlled power and oversaw the change of government. Only the oil workers, protested this, saying, why is there no workers' representation on the revolutionary committee? But that was ignored and nobody took it up. But none of these is as important as another factor which basically caused the defeat a year later, and that was the question of urban poor. The urban poor, as I said, say in a Tehran city of, say, at that time about 3 million, less than 4 million population, 700,000. It's a huge force. In fact, the shock troops of the counter-revolution were recruited from the urban poor. And the working class had to do something to actually lead the urban poor, and it didn't. It did not take up any of the demands of the urban poor. So it neither challenged political change from above, it did not unite the organizations it had developed during the strike, and it did not take the challenge of, doing something to lead the urban poor rather than leave them for counter-revolution to recruit. So basically, within a year or so, you could say, the Islamic regime had more or less taken over most of these factory councils. The students following the Imam's line, the Polytechnic students, set up this united Shura movement in any major cities that they had. This is basically Tabriz, Isfahan, and Tehran. I know firsthand that these were actually set up, involving, in Tehran, for example, 450 different sort of factories or industrial complexes were united on this Islamic Shura, United Islamic Shura Council movement, which later on actually played a crucial role in establishing new management for these industries, bringing in now management from appointed by the government into these industries, and also turning these factory councils into Islamic societies, which were basically the police force inside these factories. So within a couple of years after the insurrection, the working class movement was more or less defeated. The Shuras, although they existed in name, but they had really become Islamic societies who were basically controlling the working class rather than leading the struggles of the working class. By 1981-82, it was obvious we are facing a period of defeat. The Iranian Revolution, you could say, had more or less vanished. Every democratic gains of the revolution was more or less defeated by the Islamic regime. So there was a period of retreat. In this period of retreat, there was a debate inside the Iranian left as what to do next. At the time, there were calls for reviving the factory committees, the mass assemblies at the factory level. That would be one way to revive the mass movement, if we push for mass assemblies at factory levels. But obviously, during a period of defeat, you can hardly go to that type of activity. So that fizzled out after 2-3 years. It didn't get them anywhere. There was also the usual traditional call for, okay, now let's build trade unions. Not that we cannot do anything else, let's build trade unions. But again, for a working class which has no tradition of trade unions, at least, as I said, almost over half of it has only become a working class for the last 15 years. It's very young, both in terms of age and in terms of tradition and history. So there is no tradition of trade union activity. How can you build a trade union without any previous tradition of trade union activity in clandestine, condition? It is not easy to build a union clandestinely. At the time, there was also another alternative suggestion which some of us were raising, which was you should approach it more in terms of the model of, I don't know if comrades remember, the Spanish or the Portuguese workers' movement just before the overthrow of dictatorship. Factory commissions, basically clandestine little groups of worker activists in each factory, and then some form of coordination between these towards a national union, a sort of overall union rather than individual trade unions, like the model of, say, Solidarity in Poland, where you have a sort of national union, one overall union. It's a lot easier under dictatorship to organize that way than the way of the vast majority of Iranian left, which was eventually to opt out for forming trade unions. And you are probably as aware as I am, after 30 years or so of a struggle for building trade unions, we have hardly built one. There has been a lot of attempts. In fact, a lot of the actual trade unions that have come into existence are more or less in the traditional sector of the Iranian economy, where they had this tradition of trade union from the pre-1953 coup period, like, say, print workers, transport workers, oil workers. But most of the new industries where there was no such tradition has hardly succeeded in building anything over the last 30 years. And the Iranian government basically waits for all these type of trade union activities. As soon as they raise their head above the ground, just chops it all off. And it is hell-bent on not allowing any form of workers' organization of this type developing in Iran. And lately, over the last also in the last 10-15 years, we have had a huge upsurge in the actual struggles of the working class. In terms of organizational gains, there is hardly anything to speak of. A lot of committees have been set up by workers' activists and sort of socialists and leftists in order to help this process of forming trade unions, but that hasn't got us anywhere either. Lately, from some of the sort of statements and manifestos coming out of some of the workers' activists, there seems to be actually an understanding of what I just suggested. Let's rely more on clandestine committees inside the factories, and let's see what we can do in terms of overall organization rather than going for individual unions. It's a lot easier to recruit individuals to to a national union than to actually build a union in one factory, because that opens you to a lot more to repression than otherwise. So there seems to be at the moment this, alongside another tendency which is very significant among some of the workers' activists, you now see these statements that without a party we cannot really go anywhere. We need a political party. Without some form of political leadership, this movement is not going anywhere. In fact, individual workers' struggles are a lot easier defeated than if we had some form of workers' political party. The question of workers' political party is being raised now by worker activists. So given these three phenomena, I think factory commissions, factory committees, clandestine factory committees, and approach towards overall organization rather than trade organization, and the tendency towards more political organization or the need for political organizations are a good sign, which, if we are entering a new era in terms of the politics of the whole region, which I think we are, although I agree with what comrades early in the morning said, it's very risky. You know, it can go either way. The forces opposed to this deal are now a lot more desperate than ever before to actually destroy any deal. In fact, if anything, the risk for war is now greater than before. But there's also quite a lot of indication that there are strong sections of the American and the Iranian ruling class which want a deal. Because I think what some of the comrades refer to, what is happening is we are, after sort of 30 years or so in terms of Middle East politics, returning to pre-Iranian revolution period in which European capitalists and American capitalists actually prefer to rely on Iran to control the region rather than anybody else. The Shah was being sort of promoted as a sort of sub-imperialist in the region. There is quite a lot of that type of talk you see now in the analysis that comes out of Washington and Tehran, that, you know, given the skilled labor force, Iranians have the educated labor force, the big base. It's a huge country with a lot of resources, with a lot of muscle, and as you can see, the state bureaucracy has grown and has become quite sophisticated. It's no longer a few mullahs, you know, behind the scenes ruling the place. There's quite a, you know, clever technocracy that has developed during the last 20 years or so inside the Iranian government. Iranian government is not what it was 30 years ago. It's a lot more professional, it's a lot more sophisticated, and it's all young, more or less young recruits after the revolution into many posts within the state. So there's also that tendency that this could lead to Iran, because don't forget, if you leave everything else aside, the fact that this deal has taken place means the Iranian regime has been recognized. It has been given some form of official status now, which was not granted before. This in itself is a major achievement for the Iranian government, to actually force the West to recognize it as a legitimate state. As I said, the risk for war, in my opinion, is even greater now than it was before. But my own estimation is that there's enough forces on both sides to make the deal go few years further, at least. You know, it's not going to, you know, collapse in the next few months. Let's put it like that. So given these two factors, I think we are entering quite an interesting period in terms of Iranian working class movement, say in the next 5 to 10 years, given these tendencies. Because a few years ago, IMF did a paper on investment possibilities in Iran, and they earmarked projects that are currently on the table, which would require something like $700 billion investment in order to get off the ground. Even if a couple hundred billions of that they can attract in terms of foreign investment, that would be a huge boost for the Iranian regime. And as you can see, every European foreign minister rushing to Tehran to not fall behind in terms of getting the deal. If the forces who want the deal to be broken off don't succeed, there is possibility of major developments in the next 10 years. There are lots of huge oil, gas, petrochemical, medical. There are lots of areas in which the Iranian capitalism are just dying for foreign investment in order to grow. So I myself am optimistic in both sense, in the sense that there are new elements within the Iranian working class which shows there could be a turn in terms of where we go next. And also in terms of Iranian sort of a state becoming less able to suppress this movement in terms of the economic development, the confidence that it may give to the working class. So I myself, although I agree that the risk is even higher now than before, I myself am a bit optimistic. I think we can, in the next few years, see major new development in the working class movement.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, I'll open up to the floor. I'll also tell our viewers online that I'm just going to stop it for a bit while we get the questions and contributions from the floor, and I'll bring it back in a second. Raise your hands, please, if you'd like to speak. Peter, then you comment, and then Peter.
Yeah, thanks for that, Torab. I was interested in what you were saying about the need